The shiur is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmat, and the Neshama of Mitch's father, Zichrono Livracha, should have an aliyah, as well as I will connect the shiur. Those of you who saw the source sheet that went out, so connected to Rabbi Sax's, not only to his memory, but also to some of his Torah, and it should be l'schut nishmato as well. So I'm going to share the screen. So just let me know when everybody sees it. You should see it now.
You can.
Yeah.
Can.
Yes.
Okay. So the okay. So the basically, as it turns out, I mean, it's a today for for any of the I won't say the North Americans, because the Canadians don't really care about it, but in terms of the expats from the United States, so today is Thanksgiving. We're going to touch towards the end of this year a certain controversy. What I found to be fascinating, how three different Gedolim of the mid-20th century who lived within a less than a 10-mile radius, one of the other, less than 15 kilometers, one from the other, had very different approaches to the way that they looked at particularly Thanksgiving with regard to the issue that I'm going to be focusing on today in terms of uvichukotehem lo telechu. As you know, normally speaking, I connect the question that we deal with to the Parshat HaShavua. So I'm not only connecting it because today happens to be Thanksgiving. I guess if I were giving the shiur in the United States, so then I would connect it to because of Thanksgiving. But Thanksgiving isn't as big of an issue here. I mean, I know for some of the Americans it really still is, but it happens to be, and I don't know if this shows a certain hashkacha pratit, but Thanksgiving almost always falls out on Parshat Vayetze. And I find that very interesting. It's probably just a coincidence, but still, it's an interesting coincidence, because the parsha, perhaps more than any other parsha, and certainly it's the first parshiyot. I mean, you can quibble and say perhaps the Yosef story is also involved with it, but I think that the question of how Yaakov deals with Haran and how Yaakov deals with Lavan, so it becomes a prototype, really, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, of how a Jew as an individual, but also how the Jewish people throughout history have dealt with the question of dealing with being a minority in a foreign culture. And that is, of course, at the heart of the halacha that we're going to be discussing later on, of uvichukotehem lo telechu. But before we get into the halachic side of things, I'd like to deal with it more from a philosophical perspective. And here I want to focus on two different ideas that come up in the parsha, in the midrashim of the parsha, the parshanim. So at the very beginning, you don't have the psukim in front of you, but at the very beginning, when Yaakov arrives in Haran, and the first people that he meets upon arriving are the shepherds at the well, waiting for enough people to come in order to remove the rock, which is at the Evan al Piha Be'er, the rock which is on the sitting on the well, and all of the story in terms of Rachel and Yaakov coming and moving it by himself, etc. When Yaakov addresses those shepherds, so he basically says to them, he addresses them as achai, my brothers, right? They're total strangers. He's never seen them before in his life. He doesn't even know exactly where he is. He says, me'ayin atem, where are you from? He wants to He doesn't know yet that he knows he's in the general vicinity of Haran, but Waze hasn't gotten him to exactly where he needs it. He hasn't put in the location for the well. And so he asks, where am I? And he addresses them as Achai, my brothers. And the Ramban on that pasuk says the following. Well, he quotes a midrash in the Psikta that says the following. Yesh Omrim, this is the first source. Yesh Omrim, she'amar lahem achai derech musar, k'mo she'amar l'roim achai me'ayin atem. In other words, Yaakov, wherever he is, he talks to them as his brothers. This is actually a little bit later in the parsha, but it's a question of simply you're a foreigner, right? Yaakov is a newcomer to this place, and yet derech musar, you view yourself as not being apart from the society which you find yourself, but rather it's very much appropriate to say achai, my brothers. Right? The Ramban just simply brings this as a clearly a strong possibility, and of course it harks upon the basic question of how we should view ourselves. Should we be viewing ourselves really as brothers, or should we be viewing ourselves as being apart? That's just perhaps as an opening. But if we continue in the parsha, one of the most dramatic stories in the parsha is, of course, the story in which Lavan switches Leah for Rachel, and Yaakov, as a result, all of his best laid plans become overturned. And the Midrash has I've only taken a bit of the Midrash because the Midrash that deals specifically with the points that I want to talk about, but this is an incredibly rich Midrash dealing with various layers in the story. But the Midrash says the following. It's in the Breshit Rabbah, it's number 2. Vayasof Lavan et kol anshe makom vayas mishteh. So Lavan gathers everyone together and makes the mishteh. The Midrash is probably focusing, it doesn't say so explicitly, but I think the Midrash is focusing on why the Torah has to tell us the details of the nature of the mishteh, the fact that Yaakov will that Lavan will say 7 days have to transpire before Yaakov can take Rachel as his second wife, etc. In other words, the details of the story, we know that the Torah is not always rich in details with regard to the events. So every detail becomes a focus for further deliberation. So here we have an instance of that. Right? Why do we have to know that it becomes basically a communal celebration? So the Midrash says the following: Kines kol anshe mekomo. He gathered all of the people together. Amar lahem, yodim atem. We all know. Remember, Yaakov has been working now for 7 years for Lavan. Shehayinu dechukim lamayim. We had a water shortage. After all, that's the idea. The story at the well is indicative that there's just not enough water for everyone, and they have to apportion it appropriately. The Kevan Shabbat Tzaddik Hazelikan. Since this tzaddik has come to us, since this Jew, if you will, has come to us, Nitbarchu Amayim, right? The Jews have brought us prosperity. Amridan le Uma Hanilach. What are we going to do? In other words, they are aware that if Yaakov marries Rachel, there's a good chance that he's going to take Rachel and move back to Canaan, the same way that Rivka, his aunt, was taken and brought to Yitzchak. To Yaakov's mother. Amar lahon. So he said to them, in bayin, if you are willing to, in bayin atun, ana mirame be v'yahiv le Leah. So they hatched the plot together. In other words, it's not just Lavan's doing. It takes a village to fool a Yaakov, right? To basically it's saying we're taking a look at the Jew. We want him in our midst, and that so let's make sure that he stays with us. So we're going to at least extend it another 7 years by switching Leah with Rachel. Duhu Rachim Lahada Rachel Sagi. He loves Rachel dearly. Vuhu Aved Acha Gabchon Shiva Shanin Ochrim. He's going to work another 7 years. Amrin Le Avid Maida Hanilach. So it's not just Lavan's plot, it's the entire community's plot that's in on it. And now the Midrash. Excuse me?
Yeah, why isn't Lavan considered a Jew?
Why isn't Lavan considered a Jew?
Yeah.
Because Lavan he's a member of the family, but he hasn't accepted any of the he's not part of the brit, he's not part of the covenant.
Is he not? He's the uncle, isn't he?
He's an uncle, and Abraham has brothers, he has Nachor, but they're not part of the covenant. They haven't been incorporated. We see later on Lavan at the end of the parsha when he says goodbye to Yaakov. It's very clear that there's a boundary being drawn between, and there's a treaty being made between Lavan and Yaakov, but not only between Lavan and Yaakov, but between, from Lavan's perspective at least, from the God of Yaakov with the gods of Lavan. In other words, so Lavan is an outsider. Rivka had to leave to become part of the new of this new family with Yitzchak. So now the people of Haran in this story are deeply involved in the subterfuge. Kula Yoma have machlalin be. The entire day, in other words, it wasn't just a moment that happened, that they switched Leah. The whole day they keep Yaakov basically. We'll say that he is. My word English is leaving me this morning. But anyway, basically he's being distracted. The Kevan Da'al Biramsha.
They keep him occupied.
Correct. They want to distract him. They keep him occupied all day long. Kevan Da'al Biramsha, when he came in the evening, he's apparently, according to the Midrash, he's very surprised. Amar lahon mahu kedin. Right? Why are you doing this? Like, what, this should be just a family celebration. Why are you so deeply involved in my wedding? Amrinle, they said to him, don't you understand? At gamalt chesed bischutech. Right? We're grateful to you. We value your contribution to our society. V'havei mekalsin kodmi v'amrin. And they were dancing in front of him and saying, and this is the Middle East after all, Hali! Hali! Right? This is the same type of call that you might find in the Middle Eastern societies to this day. Hali, Hali! But they were saying, Hileya, Hileya. Right? They were, while they're basically marching him to the slaughter, they're saying, okay, Yaakov, this is our party. Hileya, Hileya. It is Leah. It's Leah. Birabsha. So now in the evening, Atun ma'alta v'chafun betzina. So they go upstairs, right? They've had the chuppah or whatever they've had in terms of the marriage ceremony, and now they go upstairs to the honeymoon suite, and they extinguish all the candles. Amar lahen mahu keden. So he said, now again, the same mahu keden that he said before, right? Before he said mahu keden, why are you doing this? So here too, he's saying mahu keden. I don't understand what's going on. Explain this to me. Amrule ma'at savur. Da'anan dichrin dichavatchon. What do you think? That we are rams, we're animals like you? In other words, here's the same people who a few moments ago told him, At gemalt chesed b'schutech, right? You gave us all of this wonderful chesed, and we are grateful to you. And at the same time, they're underscoring to the Jew that we are more genteel than you are. Of course, we're going to extinguish the lights because, this is a holy moment. This isn't the time to be, to have the lights on and having this, this consummation of a marriage, viewing it just simply as the coupling of two animals, right? The mating of two animals. So we have our customs, and you of course are going to be expected to keep to those customs. Now, by keeping to those customs, of course, that's where the deception is going to come in, because that's the moment where, of course, Leah is now switched with Rachel. V'chol hahu leila, that entire night, Havet Savichle, right? This is a plaintive moment in the midrash. The whole night he was calling out to her, Rachel, Vihi Anyale, and she answered him. Bitsafra, in the morning, Vihinehi Leah. In the morning, as the pasuk says, here it was Leah. Now the lights are back on, and he sees who it really was all night long. So this midrash is an incredible midrash. I mean, the continuation of the midrash is also incredible. Then the midrash switches to the discussion or the conversation of Leah and Yaakov. Yaakov accuses Leah at that moment of being party to it, and Leah's response. But that's not for me right now, but I recommend reading the rest of the Medrash. But here, these few lines, the Medrash is really encapsulating what is the dilemma of the Jew in a foreign culture. On the one hand, he's part of the culture. He is perhaps even valued as part of the culture for the contributions that he makes to the overall society. At the same time, there is a prejudice against the Jew. This idea saying that ma'at savur, what do you think? Da'anan dichrin dichavatchon, that we have your primitive rituals. We are a much more advanced society, and you're coming into the society. We're welcoming you. We're allowing you to be in our society, perhaps, but we're never quite forgetting who you are, and we're also looking down at your values and your expectation. And to top it all off, right, this very point, this seeming gentility, the seeming high culture is what is going to lay at the heart of the persecution of the Jew. Right? This is all encapsulated in this little vignette as described by the Medrash. And the Medrash views the launching point for this from the terms of the pshat of the psukim, because the Torah tells us that Lavan included the community. What the Torah is saying, the Medrash is saying, we don't need the community here for the storyline. The only reason the community is brought in is to tell me that the community is part of the storyline. That had it not been for the Haran community, so the deception and the subterfuge never would have happened. So that is that's the midrashic background, if you will, for the question that I want to be focusing on, namely the universalism and as opposed to particularism. How do we view our role in a larger world, in a larger society? And here I want to basically differentiate and compare and contrast Rabbi Sax's Zichrono Livracha's approach as he laid it out most fully in the dignity of difference, as opposed to Rav Soloveitchik. And perhaps I'll start with Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik discusses this in different places, most famously in an essay which was originally published in Tradition magazine of the Tradition journal, I should say, called Confrontation, in dealing with the outside world. But in one of the volumes that was of his writings that was published posthumously, Community, Covenant, and Commitment. So the Rav basically lays it out in the following way. The Jewish religion never maintained that our faith is destined to become universal in order to save mankind from damnation. Our prophets and scholars have taught that all men who live in accordance with divine moral standards will share in the transcendental summum bonum, which was promised to God-fearing and God-loving people. Summum bonum means the ultimate good at the end of days. However, this tolerant philosophy of transcendental universalism does not exclude the specific awareness of the Jews of the supremacy of their faith over all others. Okay, but here, and that's very a very important line. In other words, the Rav is saying that by virtue of, and this is a question, of course, what do we mean by Am Skula, right? A chosen people. So there are two basic approaches in Jewish thought. One idea, most famously put forward by the Kuzari, and it follows in the Ramchal, the Maharal, the Ramchal, perhaps Rav Kook as well, going in this direction, basically views the idea of Am Skula is that by virtue of the acceptance of the Torah, there is a certain supremacy to the Jewish people, to the Jewish neshama, on a metaphysical level. The other approach, which is a more rationalist approach, doesn't say that Am Skula means that we have any inherent superiority because of our Kabbalat Torah. It means that we have more responsibility, and that's what's given us this this role as the chosen people. And of course, anyone who is interested in joining is welcome to join and to become part of that mission. So the mission has not made us a superior people, but has given us a, if you will, a superior mission. That is the second way of looking at it. But and the Rav, by the way, is definitely a proponent of that second idea. However, that doesn't mean that the religion, the faith, isn't to use his term, the supremacy.
Михаил написала Рига, что ти меот папас.
Hello?
Sorry, excuse me.
Okay. As a matter of fact, the act of appraising the worth of one's particular religious experience. Now he compares this to because after all, we've just said that there is this universality. We respect other people's faiths, yet we view ours as being the superior faith. So by saying that, as a matter of fact, the act of appraising the worth of one particular religious experience on the highest axiological level constitutes the very essence of the transcendental performance. So it's basically, the Rav says that it's impossible for me not to view it that way. In other words, if I am to view other religions as being on par, then there's no reason for me to be a Jew. It's basically an either or type of proposition. So for the Muslim, let's say, so then he should also feel the same way about his faith that I feel about mine, but he happens to be wrong, right? That's basically the idea. In other words, I have a respect for other people's faith experiences, but at the same time, from my perspective, from our perspective as Jews, we have to view this as the supreme faith, or the best possible way to achieve some kind of communion with God. The feeling of axiological equality of all faiths as a component of their individual religious experience is a contradictio in objecto. It's basically, the Rav says it's a contradiction in terms. You can't have an axiological equality. That by definition is a contradiction in terms. Religious tolerance, so then what is religious tolerance? Asserts itself in the knowledge of the existence of the variety and plurality of God experiences. That, of course, we acknowledge, and the recognition that each individual is entitled to evaluate his great unique performance as the most redeeming and uplifting one. In other words, this is where tolerance comes in. Tolerance doesn't mean that I create a relativism between faiths and between ideas. What it means is that I am tolerant, right? I tolerate something, which means that I don't necessarily agree with something. I disagree with these other faith experiences as being the best possible way. Maybe some are legitimate and some are illegitimate. That might be dependent on perhaps on Shivat Mitzvot B'nai Noach and things along those lines. But I am tolerant of them, that each of the members of those faith communities has the right to recognize his or her particular faith as being the one which is the most redeeming and uplifting one, to use Rav Soloveitchik's term. So that is how the Rav is dealing with this type of question, was how do we view the Jew as opposed to the surrounding community? The Rav would say we have respect for the surrounding community. We share values with the surrounding community. And he says all of this in different places. We share values with those communities, but we cannot speak in terms of our faith experiences, because by definition, we're on a collision course in those with regard to those different areas of faith. The Rabbi Sachs had departed significantly from this way of thinking. Rabbi Sachs, and here he ran into a lot of criticism for his position, and it forced him to come out with the second edition of Dignity of Difference. And you're going to see the selected quotes here with regard to his idea. Rabbi Sachs felt that this idea of supremacy speaking of supremacy, so he didn't quite say it was problematic, but he disagreed with it. So in the first edition, he says the following. By the way, I took these quotes in Tradition magazine back in, I think it was in 2011. So Dr. Alan Jotkowitz, he lives in Beersheba, so he wrote a critique of Rabbi Sachs in terms of this, a very respectful critique. He has a tremendous admiration for Rabbi Sachs, but in terms of the comparison, so if you're interested in a much fuller discussion of this question, so I certainly recommend his essay. But here, so it's interesting to see the difference between the first edition and the second edition. In the first edition, Rabbi Sachs writes the following: in the course of history, God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to Jews, Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims. Only such a God is truly transcendental, greater than not only the natural universe, but also the spiritual universe articulated in any single faith. And it's basically the Rabbi is saying, Rabbi Sachs is saying that it is impossible to, if God is beyond all of he transcends our dimensions, so he also transcends our spiritual dimensions. We can't possibly, any particular person or any particular group cannot possibly capture all of the different facets of the experience that is expected of mankind to to cleave to God. So there are, as a result, a multitude of different approaches, and they seem to be morally equivalent. Any specific language of human sensibility. How could a sacred text convey such an idea? It would declare that God of all humanity is God of all humanity, but no single faith is or should be the faith of humanity. I mean, you compare that to what we just saw in Rav Soloveitchik, right? So, that is, of course, very much at odds with what the Rav said, because it could be, as he said, that that we don't expect every person to accept Judaism, but at the same time, we're saying that there is a supreme faith. So Rabbi Sachs seems to be rejecting that. As you can see, in terms of the flack that he took, it forced him to rephrase this. In the second edition, right, the same paragraph reads, "As Jews, we believe that God has made a covenant with a singular people." So he begins by, this idea which didn't it's expressed elsewhere, but still here he begins the discussion by saying that we have this singular covenant, but it does not exclude the possibility of other peoples, cultures, and faiths finding their own relationship with God within the shared frame of the Noahide laws. In other words, this is a much more muted statement than the first statement, much more muted. And here he also throws in, which it was perhaps hinted at in the first paragraph. In other words, the first paragraph, he only speaks of the monotheistic faiths. Now we can leave aside for the moment, is Christianity avodah zarah or not? We'll leave that aside, okay? But we'll assume it's certainly one of what we call the monotheistic faiths. It's certainly considered the Judeo-Christian ethic, etc. So he's taking Christianity, he's taking Islam, and he's mentioning those faiths specifically. No, Buddhism isn't mentioned, Shintoism isn't mentioned, right? No mention of Hinduism, nothing, right? So it's basically the faiths that are the monotheistic faiths. Here, in the second telling of it, he makes that explicit within the shared frame of the Noahide laws. So it could be that, of course, you need to know that one of the Shivat Mitzvot B'nai Noach is Avodah Zarah, right? So there, because after all, let's not forget that it's written for the broader audience, which is not a Jewish audience and not even necessarily a Christian audience. It's for a worldwide audience. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of copies have been sold of Dignity of Difference, but still, it's for a Jewish reader, we've focused on the covenant, we focused on the Brit, and we have a notion that other people as well have an ability to find their own relationship with God, as long as they accept Shivat Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Okay, so it's a much more muted way of saying what he had said earlier. These laws constitute, as it were, the depth grammar of the human experience of the divine. In other words, now he's focusing on what those Shivat Mitzvot B'nai Noach are, the Noahide laws, without expressly stating what they are, of what it is to see the world as God's work and humanity as God's image. God is the God of all humanity, but between Babel and the end of days. Now, note that he's added that. He's speaking to our audience, I think, in this statement, because he's saying that when the end of days, so at that point, Bayamahu Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad, at that point, everyone should be recognizing the Jewish experience. But until then, from the time that the world has fragmented, at the time of Bavel, Migdal Bavel, until the world recoalesces into one unit by Yomahu, so then we have this multitude of faiths which have to accept Shivat Mitzvot B'nai Noach. So it's in a way, it's a very different type of paragraph than the first paragraph. I don't think that he's backed down, though, from his basic assumption that there is an equivalency, at least in the interim period between now and Yemot HaMashiach. There is an equivalency in the eyes of God of the different faith communities. Now, I'll skip the middle paragraph for a moment and go to the last paragraph. The truth of the beating heart of the monotheism is that, and here's again the first edition, is that God is greater than religion, that he is only partially comprehended by any faith. He's my God, but also your God. He's on my side, but also on your side. And so this is a key phrase. He exists not only in my faith, but also in yours. Now here, in the second reading, the truth at the beating heart of monotheism, right? Again, he said that in the first time as well, that God transcends the particularities of culture and the limits of human understanding. Right, so he's the idea of him being only partially comprehended by any faith is not being stated here. Right, it's just that it transcends, because God is beyond anything that of human understanding. That's a pretty powerful statement. Now, that's Rabbi Sachs. Now here in this particular paragraph, he didn't change it from one version to the other. It's the same. But here now, what do you do with this? If you believe that basically all faiths, right, at least the monotheistic faiths, are legitimate, and they are not only legitimate because the Rav also said they were legitimate, but that they're equivalent, and it's just a question of whose faith community it is, and each community has its own particular vantage point and own particular mission. So so then what do you do with this? So then the supreme religious challenge is to see God's image in one who is not our image. That is the converse of tribalism. In other words, basically all religions are now going to view God as being as having they have a similar God view, if you will. But it is also something other than universalism. It takes differences seriously. He's saying that just because I view, to go back to that original statement, that God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to Jews, Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims, right? That is that key line. So that still holds true, but nevertheless, it takes the differences seriously. Because I feel that it's not just simply, okay, if I grow up in a certain community, right, I don't know, there'll be local foods, right? So is there really a difference between sushi and gefilte fish? No, there isn't really any difference per se. I can appreciate sushi more than gefilte fish, and I probably do, right? But but it just happens to be that certain foods evolved in certain cultures for whatever the reason. So there are those cultural foods, but there's no. I don't take the difference seriously, right? I can have at my Shabbos table. I can put out the gefilte fish and, let's say, the appetizer course, and I'll have gefilte fish and I'll have a sushi platter, right? There's no difference being taken seriously there, but the religious differences have to be taken seriously. It's not simply that different views of God have evolved in different places or in different communities or in different cultures, and now it's all a smorgasbord, but rather the differences mean something. The way that I as a Jew view God and my mission and my covenant is still very different than the Muslim mission and the Christian mission. And I take those differences seriously. It recognizes the integrity of other cultures, other civilizations, and other paths in the presence of God. But nevertheless, each one of us, each faith community, has its own path. And that path is a very important path to be taken. So here we have the two very different ways, again, of looking at it. Rabbi Sachs was definitely influenced, as he points out, both on his own personal trajectory when he describes his meeting with Rav Soloveitchik as a 20-year-old in 1968, as well as in his writings and his thinking, that he's clearly been very strongly influenced by the Rav, but at the same time, he parts ways with the Rav. The Rav felt that there was a supremacy to Yahadut. Ultimately, it has to be that way if we're keeping it. And Rabbi Sachs takes issue with that. There's no question that the Rabbi Sachs's approach is by far, from a traditional halachic perspective, a much more radical position and a chiddush. It is very difficult to find really any strong makorot for what Rabbi Sachs is saying. He's charting a new course. That of course doesn't mean chas v'shalom that it's outside of the pale. But at the same time, one should recognize when one's reading it how radical it is in terms of from a traditional Jewish perspective. The Rav was a modern thinker, and others who were perhaps less modern thinkers might even take issue with what the Rav said in terms of the legitimacy of other faiths. But at the same time, the Rav is much more strongly grounded in traditional, what one call traditional Jewish thought, than Rabbi Sachs's approach. As I said, people who are more interested in reading much more about this, I really very highly recommend Dr. Alan Jotkowitz's article in Tradition. If you go onto Tradition Online, you'll be able to very quickly find it in their archives. Okay. I heard someone trying to ask a question.
Yes, Rav Sussman, if you take the view that that my faith is superior to another faith which complies with the Noahide laws, let's say that you were that Noahide.
Sorry, who's speaking? I'm just
Stephen Shaw.
Okay, okay, yeah.
Let's say that you were that Noahide complying non-Jew.
Right.
Wouldn't you be justified as that person in saying, well, why did Hashem create me? What was the point of non-Jews in the first place? If the reality is that my understanding of Hashem and my relationship with Hashem is inherently flawed or second class, well, what was the point of putting non-Jews into the world? And if you take that view, why aren't we proselytizing faith? If we take the view that our faith is superior, surely it's incumbent on us to change the world so that people become Jewish and go out proselytizing, which I don't think we do.
I think that the Rav probably would respond. It's really
we did at one time.
Well, I'm sorry.
At the time of Abraham and Yitzhak, we were out gathering in people.
Okay, so this is a larger question, and maybe I should deal with it in a future shiur. The question of should we be a proselytizing faith, and that I think was and maybe will become a machloket again. During the time of the Tanaim, right? We were clearly proselytizing. At the same time, you can find Tanaim who were in favor of proselytizing, and Tanaim who were very much opposed to it. Okay, but that was not the time to get into that discussion. So one could question whether in today's world right? Perhaps we should be proselytizing. You know, where, or I'm not taking a position. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying I think the question is a legitimate one. It was not a legitimate question just from a practical perspective when we were a persecuted minority wherever we found ourselves, because that just we were not allowed to proselytize for the moment, for the most part, even to the extent that it was a capital crime for us to do so. So so that certainly has, you know, you don't just forget about 1,800 years of Jewish experience in a generation or two. But I think it's a legitimate question whether we should be proselytizing. But I think that the Rav would respond specifically to what you're saying, Stephen, that that basically he would say that if a person were to come as an individual to me and ask me that question, so I would say, listen, you have one of two ways of going about this. Either, of course, you're welcome to join us. We're not proselytizing, but for various reasons, which I don't want to get into right now. But you, as an individual, if you want to find the truest possible way in this world of connecting with God, so here's your path to Gerut. Right. In fact, the Netziv has a very interesting comment. The Netziv says the reason what the term Am Skula means, Veitem Li Skula Mikol Ha'amim. So the Netziv says in his Perish and Hamek Davar that the term Skula means a jewel, and basically the Jewish people incorporate the jewels of the entire world. In other words, Gerim are the jewels, and any person who wants to be a jewel and come into our treasure chest, as it were, is welcome to join us. And that's what it means to be an Am Skula, to be the treasure chest of all of these jewels, those of them that were born into it and those of them who decided to join us. So that's, you know, so that path is definitely open. We're not an exclusive religion by any means. We are welcoming to the Ger, and we have pasuk after pasuk after pasuk. I think it's 36 times, according to Rabbi Lezer in the Gemara, that va'ahavtem et hager, that you should love the Ger, and it's applying primarily to the Ger Tzedek, to the person who joins us, and not to the more general sense of the stranger in our midst. So that's that's one approach. The other side, I would tell them, if you're not willing to join us, you're not interested in joining us, we respect that. But then, right, so you can look at it in one of two ways. You can say, and I think, and perhaps this is historically what happened here, right, in the Roman Empire. So fully 10%, excuse me, more than 10%, a significant minority of the Roman population before the rise of Christianity were known as God-fearers. They were people who were monotheists, who were looking admiringly at the Jewish people, but staying outside of the Jewish people. People who said, we buy into the concept, that's Shivat Mitzvat B'nai Noach. But at the same time, 613 mitzvot, that's just too difficult, right? So it's sort of saying that it's the core concepts are there, and you're recognizing that you are making a compromise if you're not willing to join. But I think the reason why Christianity took off on the basis of those people was that nobody wants to view themselves as second rate. Nobody wants to view themselves as saying, I'm making a compromise in my religious experience by not joining the Jewish people, right? By being, let's say, an outside admirer of the Jewish people, but still I'm on the outside. So, and this is what the Rav had said, that if you are a devout Christian, right? So then then you should be saying that each individual is entitled to evaluate his great unique performance as the most redeeming and uplifting one. In other words, I can't say to the Christian, I mean, I can say to the Christian, I think you're wrong. And you as the Christian can say to me as the Jew, but you're wrong, right? You've missed it. The idea is that we both have to be tolerant of the other, to accept the fact that from my vantage point, I am doing this in the best possible way. And I think that you're not. And you, from your perspective, feel the exact same way about me, that I, the Christian, am doing this in the best possible way, and you're not, right? But I'm saying it that this is the best possible way, whichever side of the table I'm on. It is the best possible way. And if you don't believe that, right? Again, now speaking to your hypothetical questioner. So if you don't believe that in Christianity, that you are indeed having this, the most redeeming and uplifting one, to use the Rav's words, so then you have to join us. That's the question. The moment that a person feels that the other faith is indeed the one which is redeeming and uplifting, so then I suppose if he's being totally intellectually honest, then he should switch teams.
Not necessarily.
Right? That's the idea. Now, the notion of, well, why then isn't the world, why don't we say that the world should all be Jews, is perhaps because it's a process. It's a process that takes 4,000 years. And that, that's something that actually Rabbi Sachs talks about at length elsewhere. It's a process that is still ongoing, that the attempt, and that's what Bavel proved, that Migdal Bavel, that is, that the attempt of working with the entire world as one is destined to failure, and the way to eventually achieve a worldwide acceptance of God is to, and however that will play out in Yemot HaMashiach, is to have a covenant with a specific people. And for that people, and this is, he writes this elsewhere, actually he writes it in Dignity of Difference. The very fact that they are different proves the dignity of difference. That's how he would understand it. Okay, but in terms of I don't think necessarily that the Rav would disagree with the basic idea that in terms of that you can't work, the world can't work, or God can't work with the world as a whole. It needs to start the same, also in a similar way, the Jewish people is divided between its Kohanim and with a certain Kedusha, as opposed to the rest of Am Yisrael. You require a certain amount of a caste system in order to uplift the whole. Now, that I think is what the Rav would respond. Okay, so we don't have much time left. Actually, very little time left. I was expecting this to be just an introduction, but we spent most of the time discussing the philosophical underpinnings. So now I want to talk about a question, and I'm not going to be able to do all of the Mekorot by any means in the next 20 minutes. But but with that, I'll do our best to cover key issues. Later on in the Torah, in Parshat Vayikra, the Torah in Sefer Vayikra, it's in Parshat Emor. Lo telchu b'chukot hagoy asher ani mishalech mipnechem ki et kol ela asu v'al katz bahem. So don't follow the path of the guy that I'm sending you to them, because because everything that they have done, actually this is in Kedoshim, that everything they've done is something which is abhorrent to me, and I have become disgusted by them. Now this is in terms of this idea of lo telchu b'chukot hagoy. Later on, in Achrei Mot, we have the different formulation of v'chukotehem lo telechu, right? Of do not follow in their statutes. So so here, there are, I'm going to skip the first paragraph, but it's within the context of Okemaasei Eretz Mitzrayim Ucheretz Canaan Lo Ta'asu. Right? Do not follow in the actions of Eretz Mitzrayim and Eretz Canaan. So now the Midrash asks the following question: V'chi ma hiniach hakatuv shelo amro. Right? In other words, why does the Torah not tell us what kind of statutes we're talking about? Halo kvar ne'amar lo yimtza b'cha ma'avir b'no v'ito ba'esh v'gomer chaver v'gomer. In other words, the Torah does tell us at other places specific instances of practices which God finds repugnant, of child sacrifice, of magic and sorcery and superstition. So all of these things are mentioned. So what is the Torah saying? B'chukotehem lo telechu. Umat Talmud lomar b'chukotehem lo telechu, shelo telchu b'nimusot shelahem, b'dvarim achakukin lahen, kegon tirtarot, kirkasaot, v'estriyot. So the answer is that you shouldn't, in a much more general sense, not have their nimusot, their mores. This is the idea. Their customs, their practices. General. What are they? Do not go to the theater, titarot. Do not go to the circuses, right? The Roman circuses. So that's very different than Barnum and Bailey. But the point is, don't be part of their cultural practices. Now, this is a halacha that requires a lot of description. What's the range of the people that we're talking about? Is it every non-Jew, chukot hagoy? So here there are three different basic approaches, but one which becomes very clearly the dominant approach. The first approach is the Sefer Yereim, who was an Ashkenazic, a French commentator in the and halachic authority of the Balei Tosfot. He says the following, that it is specifically regarding the nations of Canaan at that time. We have Kemasei Eretz, we have the people of Eretz Canaan, and also Maasei Eretz Mitzrayim. It's only those peoples that the Torah is referring to, and there and he says v'chasher hisira katuv al Maasei shivat umot v'chukotehem kach hisira Maasei Mitzrayim v'chukotehem. Right, that you're coming to this to Eretz Canaan. You're supposed to eradicate Canaanite culture. You're supposed to eradicate the practices of Canaan. By extension, you also should be turning your back on the practices of Mitzrayim, because these are corrupt cultures specifically, and so everything about them, rather, even things that seem to be neutral, are things that the Jew has to reject. Uvechukotehem lo telechu. But it's very limited in terms of the scope. Right? It's only specifically those nations at that time. That is the way that the Sefer Yereim understands it. The Sefer HaChinuch broadens it to a certain extent. He says explicitly, "V'hu adin l'chol shar hagoyim." This applies to all nations. However, why? Ki ha'inyan mipnei shehem sarim me'acharei Hashem, because they veer away from God. V'ovdin avodah zara, and they worship avodah zara, which would mean that if you're dealing with a monotheistic culture, let's say, just for for argument's sake, Islam and perhaps Christianity, so then you don't have the same kind of isur to follow their customs. The Rambam, and perhaps this is it's hard to say because the Rambam, they're all basing themselves on the writings of Chazal. But Chazal, when they're talking, certainly from the Sefer HaChinuch's perspective, all of the peoples that Chazal were speaking about were all pagans. So there was no competing monotheistic culture that we could be talking about. It was the Romans. That was their theaters and their circuses. But of course, those are also dedicated to the Roman pantheon. So it was a real culture conflict between Judaism and paganism. But what would Chazal have said a few hundred years later when the competing cultures are monotheistic? So that's perhaps an open question. The Rambam, though, takes this as applying even to seemingly to monotheistic cultures. He says, and he gives a different reason. The reason that the Sefer HaChinuch had said was because they are pagans, Ovdin Avodah Zarah. The reason that the Rambam gives for it is Hakol B'inyan Echad, who mazhir shelo yidmeh lahen, ela yiyeh Yisrael muvdal mehen, v'yadua b'malbusho u'v'shar ma'asav, kemo shehu muvdal mehen b'moda'av u'v'deotav. It's basically, the Rambam says we should be, this is a Yisur saying to us that we have to be proud of our differences. And we should be taking, and as a result, our dress should be different. Our customs should be different. We should be able to be spotted separately. And therefore, he gives, and this is based on the, based on the Gemarot and the Mamarei Chazal on the idea. And as the pasuk says, I separated you from the nations, so then you have to look different. Lo yilbash b'malbush hamiyuchad lahem, v'lo yigdal tzitzit rosho kemo tzitzit rosham, v'lo yigaleach min hatztadim v'yaniach haseyar be'emtza kemo shehen osin. That basically these ideas are that you should look different, right? And these are descriptions of Roman dress and Roman hairstyles. So don't dress like the Roman. When in Rome, right? Do not be a Roman. When in Rome, be a Jew. That's the idea of this particular pasuk. And the Rambam, though, does not differentiate in this with regard to whether whoever the culture is. The idea is to be separate from that culture. Now, I asked this, actually, it was interesting. I didn't get any response. In several groups that I'm in, I asked that people, I'm not familiar with Rabbi Sax's having spoken about this question of the Chukot HaGoyim. How does he deal with it? In fact, in terms of the halacha, I'll just show you an example, which again, I would have a little more time to do it in greater length, that the practice, that we're dealing with, as well, we'll just stick to the Rambam. How would you deal with this as such? So, interestingly, I did some digging myself, and I asked other people. I don't know. Rabbi Sachs, to the best of my knowledge, never addressed this question of how to understand this halacha. V'chukotehem lo telechu. On the other hand, I could argue certainly that the idea of, if you will, the dignity of difference is not, as Rabbi Sachs himself said, saying that you accept the other side. It takes the difference seriously, right? To go back to that line, that the idea of recognizing that there is a moral equivalence isn't necessarily the same as being willing to accept to adopt even customs of the other. Now, my guess is Rabbi Sachs, it's all a guess, all supposition, because as I said, to the best of my knowledge, he never addressed it, would be much more comfortable with the Sefer HaChinuch and saying that this is restricted to Ovdei Avodah Zarah. It's restricted to the pagan. It's not restricted to other monotheistic faith communities. But even if it were, perhaps he would say that it's not a problem. Now, this, of course, leads to just getting back to the halachic discussion. Why am I dressed the way that I am right now? Well, it's all the clothing that I'm wearing, with the possible exception of my kippah, my tzitzit, which I don't wear out even, are as Western culture. A person in his, if I were to be walking on the street, I don't look particularly Jewish per se. If I remove my kippah, and certainly if I were to shave my beard, right? So why is that permissible halachically? So this becomes a machloket actually amongst the Rishonim, but especially amongst the Achronim. In other words, when Jews were in those communities where Jews weren't forced to dress differently, right? In places in the world where Jews were expected to dress differently, it was a moot point. But when it was a question of Jews having the ability to dress as the outside world, so what would you do? So here, a very important piece, Rav Yosef Kalon, the Maharik, a Italian Acharon in the 15th century. So he has a piece. He's very influential in many contexts, especially in Ashkenazic Psak. So he says the following: Uchiyotze bo sheizkira Torah, that shelo lelech bechukotehem, the kevan shu oseh davar meshuna asher ein bo tam nigla ela shehem nohagim ken az nireh vadai kshenimshach achareihem. He adds a very important idea here, that and it's not necessarily so totally clear, but he basically says that the isur of v'chukotehem lo telechu is dealing with specifically a davar mishuneh, right? That's the key word here, that it is an odd custom that doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. Now he'll also add things that will lead to isurim are certainly forbidden. But even if you have something which won't necessarily lead to an isur, but it's just it's a type of custom, their hairstyle. Like, why should you be shaving your wearing a Roman type of hairstyle? So it's because you don't want to be like the Jews. So that is a problem. But he says, and the particular case that he's talking about was wearing the cap and gown, right? What we view as graduation garb. So developed in the Middle Ages as being the actual garb of professionals. So the question that he was dealing with was would it be permissible for a physician to wear the cap and gown, which was the garments that were worn by doctors at that time. So if you're wearing those kind of dress, it's l'chukot hagoy. You're not a better doctor by virtue of the fact that you're wearing a scarlet robe along those lines. So should it be permissible? Is it chukot hagoyim today for, I don't know, doctors to wear scrubs? Right? After all, it wasn't a Jewish practice that decided that. So he says, if it's something which has a purpose to it, and in this case, to show in a community who the doctor is, so then of course it's permissible. It's only a problem if it's basically nonsensical and you're just doing it for that sake. Based on this, the consensus has become, though there is a significant, I don't have time to get into it now, unfortunately. The Rama, the Gra is the dissenter here. But the Rama following this says that a davar shenagul to'elet כגון שדרכן של כל מי שהוא רופא מומחה יש לו מלבוש מיוחד שניכר בו שהוא רופא אומן, מותר ללובשו. So anything which is V'chein she'osim mishum kavod otam acher mutar. It's not just that you could say, well, is there a professional reason for doing it, even if it's for kavod. In other words, human dignity is also an important reason. So if you're wearing something because it's because this is the, if you will, the higher class in society wears it, so then that's significant and that's permissible as well. So that is that's the idea that the Ramah says. The Gra disagrees, and the Gra feels that that unless there's unless it's a garment that Jews would be wearing anyway, it's forbidden. Based on this, by the way, just in terms of the Psak Halacha, that Rav Moshe in the Tshuva, where he was asked with regard to wearing wearing Western clothing, so he makes the following observation, that what makes something non-Jewish, if all Jews, basically, if there's a cultural type of war, or not even war, but there's a difference. So if you go back to the medieval period, Christians wore one type of clothing, Jews wore another type of clothing. So now, even if the Christians say you can wear this Christian garb, but it's still Christian garb, today it's Western garb. It doesn't, the people who are, and forgetting about who's in the shmata business, but who is, it's not being sold specifically for non-Jews and saying Jews can also wear it. It's being sold for all the citizens of the world. So then it doesn't become non-Jewish anymore. It's just clothing. Right? It's an interesting observation that Rav Moshe makes. The question, which I unfortunately have run out of time to deal with, which I wanted to discuss, is the question of the celebration of Thanksgiving. Is that a problem to recognize a holiday which does not have necessarily strong Christian roots? It's not like saying, well, today we've drained New Year's, and even to a certain extent Christmas has been drained of religious significance, and so now can Jews celebrate a national holiday on the 25th of December? But here, when it comes to the without getting into the history of Thanksgiving, when it comes to the fourth Thursday in November, so basically it was a government edict by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s that got that rolling. It had religious significance. When they talked about Thanksgiving, they were talking about thanking Christian God. But in terms of the overall celebration, it's a much more secular type of holiday and much more general concept. Is there anything wrong with the Jew taking the day off, a Jew using this as eating turkey, having a Thanksgiving dinner? So I don't have time to unfortunately read the Makarot. I'm just going to say that here, if you take a look at the numbers, the 17 through 20 on the sheet, basically you see three different approaches. The most radical approach on one hand is the Pachad Yitzchak, that was Rav Hutner. Rav Hutner felt that it was not only a problem of Chukotehem for a Jew to celebrate Thanksgiving, but it was also perhaps bordering on Avodah Zarah for different reasons. Basically saying you're taking a holiday which has Christian roots, even though it wasn't a Christian celebration, a Christian observance, but still has Christian roots, and you're turning it into something which is Jewish and adopting it for yourself on a yearly basis. So that is definitely the Chukotehem, and very well might be a problem of Avodah Zarah as well. On the other extreme was Rav Soloveitchik. He didn't write about it, but it was known that he would finish his shiur early on Thursdays on Thanksgiving Day in YU in order to catch the flight back to Boston and to be able to celebrate Thanksgiving dinner with his family. And this is the and as reported by Rav Shechter in Nefesh Harav, he says that the Rav said that it was permissible to eat dat Rabbeinu Aitashi mutar le'achol basar hodu b'sof November b'yom Thanksgiving, right? So that you could celebrate Thanksgiving, and but he never said apparently explicitly in Shir. It's only havanu l'shila da'ato. We understood from his position that it wasn't chukot hagoyim. So presumably the reason is because along the lines of clothing today, that if you have a celebration which is a universal celebration and doesn't have any particularism in the celebration itself, right, and it's themes that Jews can appreciate, after all, how can you not talk about Chag Hodaya? How can you not talk about that? So then if a Jew wants to participate in that, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, that was the Rav. As I said, he lived just a few miles away from Rav Hutner, and they were in contact with each other, but they had very different approaches to this question. In the middle was Rav Moshe Feinstein, both in the middle in terms of the position as well as geographically between Brooklyn and Washington Heights, but on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. But he basically said that on the one hand, he has 3 or 4 tshuvot, which seem in some ways to contradict one another. But the bottom line is that he says that on the one hand, to establish it as a holiday would be a problem of chukotehem lo telechu. If I were to say, every year I'm going to religiously celebrate Thanksgiving, that would be a problem. But however, if you just say that lo l'chova u'l'mitzvah ela l'simchat hareshut, if you're just simply saying I'm recognizing the holiday and I'm eating my turkey, etc., that is not usur. As long as you're not saying it is something which is a ritual which should be kept. I'll just mention that in this context, and I apologize for going over time, but that's that I was most influenced not by the Pachad Yitzchak and not by the Rav and not by Rav Moshe, but by my mother, Zichrona Livracha, on this. My mother would said the following. We always had our turkey, our Thanksgiving turkey, but she would only serve it on Friday night. She said that as a matter of principle, I can't have a nicer meal on Thursday night than I have on Friday night. So our Thanksgiving dinner was always on the Friday of the Shabbos of Thanksgiving, that message of understanding what Jewish values are as well as what Shabbat is. So for me personally, that has very much influenced me. But in terms of
Rabbi Sussman?
Yeah.
I think that your mother must have some Hasidic roots of the Umptioner where they can move events to a different time in the week.
That could be. My mother was very talented. She was multi-talented, so it wouldn't surprise me at all. But but in any event, the question I think of getting back to the beginning of the shir, in terms of understanding, really goes to the heart of on a more, if you will, philosophical level, of trying to juggle a very critical question of how we view ourselves in the larger world, both in terms of our particularism, our being citizens of the world as a whole, and our acceptance, tolerance, and views of of different cultures. And it's something which is not a simple halachic question, yes, no, etc., but really is a very deep religious philosophical issue, which continues to develop and evolve to this very day. So it's wonderful to see you all again.
Last question.
My mother also celebrated on Friday, so
Okay.
not the only mother.
It's a good Jewish minhag.
Last question.
Yeah.
When was that medrash that we started with written?
That Medrash is Medrash Rabbah of Bereshit is attributed to the, if I'm not mistaken, to the 6th century. It's a Eretz Yisrael Midrash. So it's a collection. Medrash Rabbah is a collection. It's an anthology of Midrashim. So it includes earlier material as well. But it was edited in the 5th or the 6th century here in Eretz Yisrael, in Bereshit Rabbah.
My question really was the influence of circumstances that it was written under. Stress certain points, very valuable points, but a condition of a particular time.
Okay. It is a it certainly let's put it this way. It certainly, I think, it reflects what was going on in Byzantine Eretz Yisrael. That's a time of a great deal of persecution. It's also the rise, at that time, it's the rise of Christianity. And not the rise. Christianity has become the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century with Justinian, and that's when you have very severe persecutions of Jews beginning for the first time. At the same time, I just don't know necessarily if that particular medrash was authored, if you will, under Christian rule, or it's an earlier medrash from pagan Roman times, and that it's incorporated into the medrash. So I can't say whether it's the Jew under Christian rule or the Jew under pagan rule, but it's certainly the Jew under Roman rule, writing it and having that tension. On the one hand, let's just step back one step further. There is certainly a denigration of Jewish practices in the Roman Empire pre-Christianity, that Jewish practices are considered to be somewhat barbaric and primitive.
Right.
Even in something along the lines of Shabbat. I'm not even talking about something like Brit Milah, but certainly something like Brit Milah. But even in something like Shabbat, it's there's a real conflict in terms of whether there's a value in taking a day off from work, or that just shows laziness, that you're not working 24/7. Right, so that's an argument that goes on between Roman thinkers and Jewish thinkers. I mean, not in an argument the way that we think of arguments, but when you read their different writings. So that basic idea is definitely there. So we've gone really well over time, and I know Rabbi Liebtag is going to be starting in a few minutes. It was wonderful seeing you all again, and till the next time.
Thank you very much.
Call too. Bye-bye.